The pre-MLB era. Organized baseball had existed for decades before the MLB or its leagues even existed. There was a bunch of random clubs playing with a bunch of different rules, but the emphasis was on it being very amateur. Nobody was getting paid. In 1854, we had the first set of standardized rules, which later became the foundation for baseball. These rules were agreed upon by three teams, the Knickerbocker, Gotham, and Eagle clubs. In 1857, the National Association of Baseball Players formed, and while it was the first real organized league, it was still very amateur and being paid was against the rules. But that didn't stop some of the superstar players at the time like Lit Pike from getting paid under the table. After the Civil War, the Negro Leagues were formed for African Americans who wanted to play baseball, as the NABBP voted to refuse any club that had a black player on the team. In 1871, the NABBP became the National Association of Professional Baseball Players, also known as the National Association. This was the first fully professional baseball league that had an emphasis on paying players. This didn't last very long though, because in 1876, 6 teams from the National Association and 2 independent teams broke off to form the National League that we know today. And in 1901, the American League that we know today was formed in Milwaukee by Ban Johnson. Some charter teams were the Baltimore Orioles, though not the same ones of today, the Chicago White Stockings, which later became the future White Sox, and the Detroit Tigers. The dead ball era. The dead ball era is defined by the fact that the balls themselves that were being used in professional games were designed poorly and overused in games. A single baseball would often be in play for over 100 pitches, to the point where it was soft and tearing apart. The softness made it much more difficult to hit further, meaning games were slower, less entertaining, and it made baseball a much more strategy-driven game. Another contributing factor to this is the fact that pitchers were actually allowed to manipulate the ball before a pitch. So marking the ball, scuffing it, and spitballs were extremely common, making the ball even harder to make contact with in general. This made home runs during this era extremely rare, as well as finding base hits in general. The batting average in the professional leagues at this time dropped to 239. And the average runs per game was 3.4, which is the lowest ever. Because getting hits was so uncommon, a lot of the strategy during this era was centered around just getting on base as much as possible through bunts, walks, and if you finally got to actually make it to first base, stealing. And despite all of this, there were still stars like Ty Cobb who were able to put up historic records, like a career batting average of 366, which is one of the highest in MLB history. He prioritized stealing bases very highly, and by the end of his career, he had 897 stolen bases. There were other historic players during this era too, like Honus Wagner, who had over 3,400 career hits and a lifetime batting average of 329, and Chief Wilson, who set the record for most triples in a season with 36 during the 1912 season. And that record has still yet to be broken and is considered to be one of MLB's unbreakable records. And even though there were some generational hitters during this time, what we really saw was the emergence of some of the greatest pitchers we've ever seen in baseball, namely Cy Young. Cy Young has the unbroken record of 511 career wins, which is almost 100 wins ahead of the second place pitcher Walter Johnson, who was another great pitcher from the dead ball era. And over his 22-year career, Cy Young pitched 7,356 innings and maintained a career ERA of just 2.63. This makes him one of the greatest pitchers of all time. And if his legacy and impact on the game wasn't clear enough, MLB began honoring the best pitcher of every season with the Cy Young Award in 1956. The live ball era. The live ball era was a period of extreme rise in offensive statistics, leading to a time of records constantly being broken and completely changing the way baseball is played even to this day. We also saw the emergence and rise of some of baseball's first superstars like Babe Ruth. Starting in 1920, pitchers were no longer allowed to manipulate the balls, meaning no more scuffs, spitballs, or marks. This, combined with another new rule that required baseballs to be swapped out at the first sign of wear, meant that balls were brighter and easier to see, and when contact was made, they weren't as soft during the dead ball era, meaning the balls went much further. This changed everything about baseball, as games became much more high scoring and there was a new reliance on hitting home runs. And the perfect example of this is baseball's first real superstar, Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth played with the Boston Red Sox during the dead ball era, but it wasn't until 1920 when he joined the Yankees where he would really start to shine. In that same year, he hit 54 home runs. Not only was this unheard of, but he eclipsed every other batter in the league, nearly tripling George Sisler in this same season, who had the second most runs at 19. Babe Ruth single-handedly changed the way baseball was played offensively, turning it from a game that was centered around plays like bunting into a game that was all about power. He was breaking records left and right, with a career slugging percentage of .6897 that has lasted to this day, 714 career home runs, and a record 60 home run season, both of which lasted for decades. He wasn't the only one breaking records during this time though, as Joe DiMaggio began his career during this era, and just a few years into his career, he managed to set the record for the longest hitting streak ever at 56 games in a row. This is considered to be baseball's most unbreakable record. The live ball era was a complete reconstruction of how baseball was played, and it's considered to be one of the most exciting times in baseball history. The integration era. During the integration era, we finally start to see the color barrier being broken in Major League Baseball. There were talks to start integrating Negro League players as early as 1943, with players like Josh Gibson and Charlie Grant gaining the interest of professional teams like the Pittsburgh Pirates. Unfortunately, Kennesaw Landis, who was baseball's commissioner at the time, was an extreme segregationist and wouldn't permit it. This didn't stop everyone though, and the GM of the Brooklyn Dodgers, Branch Rickey, was determined to end segregation in baseball. So in 1946, Rickey signed Jackie Robinson to play for the Dodgers minor league team, knowing that he had the inner strength to withstand the inevitable abuse. And on April 15th, 1947, the color barrier in baseball was officially broken, with Jackie Robinson playing his first game for the Brooklyn Dodgers. This opened the door for other African-American players like Larry Doby, Satchel Paige, and Roy Campanella, who would eventually join the professional league. And while it wasn't quick or easy, more and more teams began signing players of color, including Latin American players who were facing similar challenges as African American players with getting into professional baseball. And this is the start of baseball becoming the multicultural and international game that it is today. The expansion era. The expansion era saw a huge increase and spread of the teams in the majors. Before the 1950s and early 60s, there were 16 teams in only 11 cities. By 1961, with the addition of new teams and relocations, there were 18 teams in 16 cities. This helped get professional baseball out of the Northeast and into the rest of the US market, with the addition of new cities like Milwaukee, Baltimore, Kansas City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Some teams relocated, like the Brooklyn Dodgers, who went to Los Angeles, and the New York Giants, who went to San Francisco, but other new teams were formed like the Los Angeles Angels in 1961. In 1962, the National League expanded to 10 teams to match the American League, and so they added two new teams, the Houston Colt 45s and the New York Mets. In 1969, both leagues expanded again, with the American League adding the Kansas City Royals and the Seattle Pilots, who would later become the Milwaukee Brewers, and the National League adding the Montreal Expos and San Diego Padres. The pitching era. The pitching era takes place during the expansion era. This is when the game of baseball itself underwent a lot of changes too. In 1963, the strike zone was officially redesigned and it was greatly in favor of pitchers. The new strike zone had expanded to be the area from the shoulders to the bottom of the knees. Because of this, there was a resurgence in pitching dominance, leading to the 1968 season having a record low batting average of .237. Pitchers like Sandy Koufax and Bob Gibson were able to dominate during this era. Sandy Koufax threw 4 different no-hitters, including a perfect game, with a overall 25-5 record with a 1.93 ERA in 1963. He also had amassed 2,396 strikeouts in just 2,324 innings. Bob Gibson also had one of the most dominant years ever for a pitcher in 1968. He had a 1.12 ERA, and in the World Series Game 1 of that year versus the Detroit Tigers, he had 17 strikeouts. Pitchers were dominating so much so in this era that there was a very real fear that there was going to be a second dead ball era. So in an effort to avoid this, the pitching mound was lowered in 1969 from its original 15 inches above home plate to just 10 inches. But it didn't stop there, because in 1973, in further efforts to increase offensive numbers, there was the addition of another new rule: the designated hitter. But the new rule changes worked, and once again, there was an increase in offensive stats, avoiding a second dead ball era. The free agent era. The free agent era is defined by players having much more negotiating power and choice in where they could sign as players. And this meant one thing: a lot more money was about to come into baseball. So in 1979, MLB had its first $1 million player, with star pitcher Nolan Ryan signing a $4.5 million 4-year deal with the Houston Astros. And other great players weren't far behind either, with Dave Winfield signing a 10-year contract for $2.5 million a year just 1 year later. The effects of this era are seen even today, with free agent contracts for superstars nearing close to $1 billion, like Shohei Ohtani's $700 million contract with the Dodgers and Juan Soto's $765 million contract with the Mets. The Steroid Era. The Steroid Era was when every record that seemed unbreakable was being broken, mainly thanks to the use of performance-enhancing drugs and steroids. As a fan, this was one of the most entertaining times in all of baseball. There was the 1998 race between Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa, who were trying to beat the long-held home run record, with Mark McGwire eventually doing it with 70 home runs in the 1998 season. And it didn't end there, because in 2004, Barry Bonds broke that same record with 73 home runs, and that record has yet to be broken even 20 years later. And the crazy part about Barry Bonds during this era is that he was considered to be well past his prime in age. Yet somehow at the age of 37, he led the league in on-base percentage, slugging, and WAR. And league-wide offensive stats continued to climb. It was clear to the heads of MLB that something else was going on. So in 2004, MLB implemented league-wide random drug testing. And by 2005, 11 players had already been suspended for PED usage. And that trend only continued. In 2007, the Mitchell Report was released, which was a 409-page report of a 20-month investigation into steroid use in MLB. 89 MLB players were named in that report, including some big names like Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens. This led to stars like A-Rod and Mark McGwire admitting to their own steroid usage as well. And Sammy Sosa didn't exactly admit to using steroids, but he did admit to making mistakes, but we all know what that means. The Analytics Era. The Analytics Era, also known as the Moneyball or StatCast era, is when teams started moving away from traditional scouting methods and instead started using a more data-driven analytical approach to find undervalued players. Teams like the Oakland A's utilized this a lot because they didn't have the same resources as teams like the Yankees. But other teams caught on pretty quickly, and by 2007, almost every team was invested in analytics. This same data analysis strategy was used to help optimize the way the game was played too. This caused another resurgence in pitching, with pitchers becoming more specialized, pitching less innings, and breaking new records. Because pitchers were staying in the game less, it meant that every pitcher was working to increase one thing: velocity. Players like Aroldis Chapman and Kelvin Herrera began pitching over 100 miles per hour pretty consistently. The introduction of StatCast showed that there was a very important key to going yard on these high velocity pitches, and that is launch angle. Players like Jose Bautista, Mike Trout, and Joey Votto were able to optimize their launch angle on their swing to increase their chances of hitting home runs. An optimized launch angle plus higher power slugging plus a higher velocity pitch meant that there were more strikeouts, more home runs, and less balls in play. And then the infield shift got introduced to the game. So the defending team would move 3 infielders to one side of second base depending on who was batting to try and cover the gaps in the infield. This allowed for more outs on hard hit balls, thus reducing batting averages and base runners. And because every team began implementing the shift, league-wide batting average in 2022 had dropped to 243, the 5th worst ever. The Modern Era. The Modern Era has been defined by 2 things so far: international talent and rule changes. International superstars like Shohei Ohtani have become the face of MLB, bringing in millions of fans from Japan and making millions more in the US. And it's for good reason. Ohtani is a generational talent, breaking records by having the first 50-50 season, which is 50 home runs and 50 stolen bases in a single season, as well as becoming the new all-time leading home run hitter among Japanese-born players. Not to mention all the other international talents like Ronald Acuna Jr. and Juan Soto, both of whom are already being talked about for the Hall of Fame. These are some of the best players in the game with the biggest contracts, and it's a defining factor for the future of baseball. MLB also added new rules in 2023 that were implemented not only to speed up the pace of the game, but to also make it more engaging and entertaining for fans. First, we have the pitch timer. Starting in 2023, there is now 30 seconds between batters, with pitchers getting a 15-second timer between pitches if bases are empty and 20 if runners are on base. Pitchers now also only have 2 disengagements allowed, so overall, the pace of the game is much faster. And in an effort to increase batting average and get runners on base, the infield shift has also been banned. And while this hasn't completely turned around the downtrend of lower batting averages, it's definitely kept it stable. And the last big change was to the size of the bases themselves. Bases increased in size from 15 inches square to 18 inches square. And with the rise of record-breaking international superstars, combined with these big changes to speed up the game and increase offensive stats, in my opinion, this modern era is looking pretty exciting.